11:15 on European security engagement in the Indo-Pacific. Are two sessions that have been made possible thanks to a grant from NATO. So we thank, of course, NATO for their support. And they will both be recorded and on YouTube also following this event. We are also marking today the final event of a series of CEPS events celebrating CEPS's 40 years of activities, providing independent research and analysis to European policymakers in Brussels and beyond. And so, you know, we're also thankful that you're here kind of marking this occasion with us. So I will be moderating this session, and so maybe turning to the topic of the first debate, kind of immediately. Over the next 1 hour and 15 minutes, I kind of would like to go through the past, present, and future of EU-NATO relations, taking stock of what has been accomplished, where cooperation currently stands, and perhaps understanding, looking forward, where there may be margin for further reinforcement of what is already, I'm sure the story will be told by some, a very strong relationship, and maybe amongst the strongest bilateral relationships in the world. And yet, despite this, of course, the situation in Europe in terms of security is quite alarming, right? We have war in Ukraine. We have continuous attempts to sow political instability, Russian hybrid operations. I think of grain export blockages, human trafficking. We have election interference, disinformation campaigns, and whatnot that continue to undermine European security. And not only that, you know, in and around Europe, instability in Kosovo, land grabs in Nagorno-Karabakh, and war in Gaza. And so surely there are some massive challenges that Europe is facing. And, you know, that being said, while there has been some sort of unity of response and convergence within Europe to Russia's unjustified invasion of Ukraine, a clear-eyed assessment would say that, you know, EU member states / NATO allies have not consistently been united on a full range of policy challenges over the past 2 years, and you know, the glaring example of which is war in Gaza, but there have been many more, and even now, you know, somebody who would like to provoke discussion would say that that convergence is waning, and you know, some have spoken of fatigue on Ukraine, and so this unity, you know, has been in part affected by the external influence campaigns by actors such as Russia, but in part have been of Europeans' own making, right? And there's a difference in threat perceptions across Europe. There's a difference in strategic interests amongst European states, and so this has all led to, at times, a divergence in what the correct policy solutions are moving forward. And this is, of course, I'm speaking about countries that are both EU member states and NATO allies. And so that's why I think that the debate today is so timely, because I would like to understand, you know, considering what is happening in Europe, how EU-NATO cooperation may have been affected, and also where there may be opportunities to find some renewed convergence moving forward. So in order to unpack, you know, this topic and give everyone the opportunity to respond to some of these provoking statements of mine, as well as, you know, tell a story of EU-NATO relations. We have an incredibly stellar panel for this first session. And in order, on the stage, we have Ruben Diaz-Plaja, who is a senior policy advisor in the policy planning unit of the Office of the NATO Secretary General. To my left. Skip one and go to Guillaume Riotort-Sampol, who is head of the division of the head of the newly revamped division on peace, security, and defense partnerships at the European External Action Service. Lastly, at the very end, we have Piret Pernik, a researcher at the NATO Cooperative Cyber Defense Center of Excellence. That's a mouthful, but I'm glad I got that out. And then next, between Ruben and Guillaume, we have Roberta Haar, who is a professor of foreign policy analysis and transatlantic relations at Maastricht University, and also a principal investigator for the REMIT consortium, which is a Horizon Europe project, which is the sister project also of a Horizon Europe project CEPS is participating in. And that's those who are on stage, but we would also like to engage you in the audience to make this as lively and dynamic a discussion as possible. And I'm sure you clearly have an interest in this topic if you've made it despite all the challenges. So I hope that once they've provided short, concise, impactful input to the discussion, you will engage with your questions. So with that being said, and without further ado, Ruben, over to you. Tell me a little bit, what's the story to be told about EU-NATO cooperation?
Well, thank you. Can you hear me? Yeah. Thank you so much, Dylan, and it's really a pleasure to be back at CEPS, and congratulations to CEPS, of course, on its 40th anniversary. For some reason, I think the last time I spoke at CEPS was on the day of my 40th birthday, so for some reason you reciprocated me and invited me back, so thanks, congratulations, CEPS. Look, I think an anniversary like yours is a chance to take stock of bigger trends, and you, in the invitation email, you suggested I talk a little bit about sort of past, present, future, and I think that's being in policy planning where we sometimes look at kind of the larger trends, that's a good way to start this story, right? And if you look at NATO-EU relations, and especially in the context of transatlantic relations, it's a fundamentally good story. It's a fundamentally positive story to tell, despite the issues you pointed out just now. I think looking at the sort of past, present, future narrative allows us to pick up the different paradigms we've gone through on NATO-EU relations over the last 40, if not 70 years, 75 years. If you look at the sort of history or prehistory, that's the past. We don't need to go into the details of what was happening in the 40s and 50s, but we know the big questions that were on the table back then. How to guarantee security and stability for the rules-based order in Europe in the face of revisionist and authoritarian challengers. How common values matter. And I think those paradigms are still relevant today, in fact, more so than ever. And I think point to the fundamental strategic nature, the strategic rationale for that NATO-EU relationship. Moving forward a little bit, in that sort of chronological narrative or story, I think if you look at the post-Cold War period, then we see the real blossoming, I think, of that NATO-EU relationship. Yes, there were debates about the various institutional theologies and where bits of each other fit within that larger architecture. But fundamentally, if you look at what happened over those years, the joint complementarity of strategic stability achieved through the project of enlargement, how both NATO and EU enlargement brought stability to a wider Europe and created a Europe whole, free, and at peace that we wanted during the Cold War. That, I think, points to a fundamentally positive strategic effect of that NATO-EU relationship. And of course, these were also the years of crisis management, of deployment in out-of-area operations, where we learned a lot about each other as two organizations, about how to work together and where our complementarities lie and how we can achieve effect through that. I say that as a prelude, I think, to the present. For us at NATO, we are our Secretary General calls this a decade of adaptation. And arguably that decade of adaptation starts around 2014 with Russia's first attack on Ukraine. We at NATO have been adapting to a world where strategic competition is once again on the agenda, where adversarial competitors are using the full toolkit, kinetic and non-kinetic, to destabilize, to revise, to undermine a rules-based order, starting in Europe, unfortunately, as we've seen in Ukraine. And so as NATO, we've been, coming back or returning to a series of adaptive measures to prepare for that world. And we see that adaptation fundamentally also in the NATO-EU relationship. We see that both in the way of thinking and our doctrine, but also in our practice. Doctrine, what I mean with that, I think if you look at the way that we have more closely aligned our thinking and our assessments over the last few years, starting with the NATO-EU declaration in 2016 and successively since then. But if you look at the NATO strategic concept and the NATO and the EU strategic compass, it's actually remarkable how much echoes we have of each other in those two documents. So there's alignment at the sort of doctrinal level, but even more alignment, I'd say, at the practical level, right? And I think this is a story which you were alluding to. We have brought that cooperation between staffs, between institutions, to unprecedented levels, especially if we take the metric of 2016, even more so if we take the metric of 1983 when this think tank was founded, right? You know the story around the common actions, the 74 areas that we work on across the spectrum, from hybrid to maritime to defense capacity building to operational cooperation. The cooperation in theater, in geographic areas, Kosovo, very important this year in particular, where we had close coordination, amplification of high-level messages to stabilize the situation, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Iraq, but also the cooperation we have on defense capacity building. And of course, if I mention geographical cooperation, regional cooperation, Ukraine stands massively here. I think that if the last few years since 2016 have seen a step change in the relationship, then I think the years since last year, since Russia's attack on Ukraine, have demonstrated that the value of that relationship even further. The NATO relationship, I think, there's no way around this, has been essential to responding in a unified way to Russian aggression in Europe. The unprecedented dialogue and coordination at the highest levels between our leaderships, between our councils, but also in the response that we've seen, right? On NATO's side, obviously, the collective defense response, the strengthening of our deterrence and defense posture, the new baseline. And on the other hand, the EU's multifaceted assistance to Ukraine has been both decisive and impressive. And together, this delivers a strategic message of unity in the face of what is unacceptable aggression in Europe. With that, let me quickly turn to the future, right? And I think, nobody of us in this room has a crystal ball, not even policy planners. But we can look at, I think we can safely say that the paradigm that we see now that has emerged over these, last decades of cooperation is here to stay for some time, I think, for a number of reasons. First, I think there is a solid basis on which to develop that cooperation further. Both organizations have converged in their way of thinking about the strategic environment. And I mentioned already the two documents and the common declarations and such. The strategic sense that derives from that. The fact that, geographically we are also coming closer with Finland and Sweden in NATO as full members. 96% of EU citizens will actually be protected by NATO. So there is a solid reason for us to work together. That is our 1 billion citizens that we share. Of course, the nature of the strategic environment, the threats and challenges we face also point towards the strategic logic of NATO-EU cooperation. The fact that this is an environment where both kinetic and non-kinetic means are used to destabilize, to subvert, to challenge the international order means that we need to work together as two organizations. And not to belabor this further, I think that if you look at what should be, what might be focus areas for the years to come, I think this is relatively predictable. Support for Ukraine will be top of our list as two organizations, I think, into the years to come, making sure that Ukraine has what it takes to support, to resist Russian aggression, building on the strengths of both organizations. I think that capabilities will be key, right? NATO will remain the cornerstone of collective defense for the allies, but at the same time, a European Union that spends more on defense and invests in new capabilities is fundamentally good news also for NATO. And that's something that's been underlined also in the strategic concept for NATO. The single set of forces principle is more relevant than ever, making sure that we spend well and on the right categories of capabilities is essential. The same thing goes for stockpiles, for the kind of the building up the defense production that we require to sustain our support for Ukraine, but also the basically rearming of European defense in the face of a heightened threat environment. And finally, I think the continuous cooperation to deal with the elements that result from strategic competition, looking together at the challenge that China poses for our security, that authoritarian regimes pose for our security, and therefore looking at a broader spectrum of areas where we need to strengthen our cooperation on resilience, new technologies, disinformation. But also, I'll add to that list, and this is beyond, of course, the strategic competition challenge, climate change, where we are seeing this as a crisis and threat multiplier. And I think both organizations fundamentally agree on this and are stepping up their action. And there's a lot of traction to be gained in developing that line of effort further. So I see a lot of efforts where we could take that strategic relationship further in the years to come. Thanks, Tom.
Thanks, Ruben. And maybe just a quick follow-up on that. You listed many different areas of cooperation, and I think that's good news for security in Europe. At the same time, it raises the question, if there are so many priority areas, is it possible really to prioritize? And if so, out of that laundry list of items, where would you say the top 3 areas of cooperation should be moving forward?
I mean, yeah, this is a strategic relationship, so by nature it is complex and spans a wide range of areas, and I think there's no way around that. Security is multifaceted these days. That being said, I think strategy also involves resourcing and focusing on the right resources, right? And I think fundamentally ensuring that we as Europeans or as a larger Euro-Atlantic community have what it takes to credibly resource our defense is obviously a fundamental priority, and spending more and spending better is something that you've probably heard some people at NATO talking about over the years, and I think it remains a priority for us because it underpins everything else. It actually allows us more choices, right? If we have a fundamentally more complex environment, you can do more if you have more to draw upon. I think secondly, the support for Ukraine remains fundamental. I think that the challenge that Russia's barbaric attack on Ukraine poses for European security, I think, needs no further explaining, and ensuring that it doesn't basically succeed is in all our interests. And then I think ensuring finally that we have a resilient set of societies and nations in the face of a much more turbulent environment, be it because of climate change, be it because of strategic competition, I think is a third priority I would pick out. I mean, maybe this is more me talking. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks. And maybe over to you, Guillaume. I imagine you have a very similar story to tell as the EU and NATO are cooperating. But maybe could you shed light on, is the picture as rosy as it seems, rosier, less rosy, in light of the various also developments that the EU has been bringing forward to strengthen, the European defense market, European defense industry, and whatnot?
Good morning, Dylan. How are you? Good morning, everyone. Very happy to be here on behalf of the European External Action Service. I wonder whether we should let the wonderful female panelist on my side, so as to avoid a manual opening from institutional approaches and then having the full criticism. May I propose such a thing?
To switch the order. Sure, we can give the last word to the EAS. Then let me go to to Piret, who is a researcher and you know can help us focus in on a few areas in particular that Ruben has mentioned, cyber defense being one of them, hybrid threats, I suppose, as well. You work in a center of excellence. You're a researcher, so it would be good to understand, you know, your analysis on this, and perhaps provide Guillaume with some food for further thought. No, you have to.
Good morning. First of all, thank you for inviting me here. I'm very happy to talk about and share my ideas. And I try not to be overly critical, but offer some maybe constructive thoughts. First, I would like to say a few words about the center I represent, and disclaimer that my thoughts are only my personal views. So we are located in Tallinn. We bring together 39 nations. We are interdisciplinary and a multinational center. So we bring together NATO allies, EU countries, and also countries from Indo-Pacific, as well as Ukraine. And we work very closely with industry, academia, and national governments. We are not part of the NATO structures. We are accredited by Allied Command Transformation and one of the 30 Center of Excellences. So our focus area is to support NATO as well as our member states. And we run big cyber defense exercises. Maybe you have heard, locked shields, cross wars. We also support NATO's biggest cyber defense exercise, cyber coalition, and we also conduct various training courses and research. So with that, I would say that I would like to dive a little bit deeper into one of the success areas of EU-NATO cooperation, cyber security and cyber defense. And looking back, the first time I wrote about this subject was exactly 10 years ago, and I totally agree what has been said, that cooperation has expanded, deepened, intensified. However, still I would say it's more stuff to stuff and cooperation, political consultations, and it has maybe less institutionalized that I would have expected. Of course, in cyber domain, we two organizations faced very many same issues. I would say cyber threat landscape is very similar and shared. Broadly speaking, there are common interests in terms of application of international law, the UN framework for responsible state behavior, etc. But at the same time, of course, different mandates and competence areas of two organizations come into play. And if you look back the last decade, I would say the development on the EU side has been really impressive and a little bit even confusing. I think I counted 15 till 20 different legal acts and policies during the last decade. And the proposals, there are a lot of new institutions. So on the NATO side, of course, we have more development concerning cyber defense operations and the military role in cyber. I know I can't take too much time, but I wanted to highlight what are the constant areas of cooperation since 2016, I would say, from the joint declaration. So I already mentioned staff-to-staff information sharing and coordination. also regarding the joint statements of attributing malicious or acknowledging the attribution of allies and member states of malicious cyber attacks. Then other types of information and intelligence sharing and joint threat assessments between various staffs, NATO, international military staff, EU military staff. Also, we already have technical agreement between NATO, CIRC, and EU CERT since 2016, then information exchange between various centers of excellencies, analysis cells, etc. Then we have the third area is crisis management and response, coordinating the different playbooks. Also, NATO has participated at the cyber diplomacy toolbox tabletop exercise, etc. Also, information sharing regarding cyber defense concepts and doctrines, other exercises, cyber capacity building, and the best resource, just to highlight, is the 8th progress report from June 2023, which you find online. And but more areas have been added, and just to name few, for example, military mobility, cyber aspects of that, and how do we protect critical infrastructure such as transportation, for example, sea harbors, railways, which are very crucial for NATO supply chain and logistics, emerging disruptive technologies, standardization, certification, and interoperability of CIS, and also research and innovation. So when I looked the last time I put forward the recommendations in 2019, I was surprised and happy to see that some of those have been implemented. So for example, working groups on common threat assessments. We have now a working group on disinformation. There's a task force on resilience and critical infrastructure, which also published recommendations this year. Then we have very, very good cooperation, as I mentioned already, in the area education, training, and exercise. However, still I haven't seen that joint curricula has been developed as also recommended in the EU policy on cyber defense, and the courses have not yet been opening up. But I hope this is just a technical issue, and as soon as those frameworks are concluded, it will be solved. So coming now to conclusion and maybe my recommendations, I do understand that there are issues with multilateral projects, investment to multilateral projects, and according to European Defence Agency, the investments have actually decreased in 2022, for example, like PESCO projects and so on. However, at the same time, the European Defence Capability Development Plan highlights defensive cyber operations and cyber warfare advantage as priorities. So I think there's benefit to cooperate with NATO in that regard, also to have some solutions now for technical issues such as platform and procedures and protocols to actually share information. I don't want to talk about trust more, but then I have a number of other recommendations and which I can go into. For example, just to name a few, both organizations highlight that we need now move to more proactive cyber defense posture. And what does it mean below the threshold of attacks, and how do you operationalize this? I think there's a rich area for discussion. And this is also related to rapid reaction teams, because both organizations have those for many years and now have came up with new initiatives on both sides. Also, I mentioned already military mobility. And then last but not least, civil-military cooperation and private-public partnerships, because also both organizations prioritize those in their policies. And then EU, of course, has a very good track record in cooperating with the private sector industry, for example, through ENISA. So with that, I think I will conclude, and maybe just if I still have time,
Briefly, yeah.
to mention that maybe some streamlining as well. For example, NATO Cyber Defense Pledge questionnaire, and now ENISA is coming out with the new cybersecurity index. So to collect data and maybe share, so countries will not have too much administrative burden. And then also the new technologies, 5G, critical supply chain. So yes, with that, I will finish and happy to share more thoughts. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Piret. I take from this, from kind of a more operationally focused, your standpoint, which is a little bit more operationally focused, that it's a mixed bag, that you know, some simplification may be required, especially in the eyes of the general public who might not be as aware of the complexity of the relationship. There might be some overlapping, or one might call it constructive competition elements, and but that, you know, there is work ongoing. That, you know, it's a worthy investment to have these centers for excellence, especially because you know, in some way it fosters bottom up, you know, sharing of knowledge amongst member states, who many of them are both allies and EU member states, of course, and so, you know, the EU-NATO relationship also stands to benefit from the individual members buy-in to an organization like the Center for Excellence. So in line with, of course, Guillaume's request to have the last word, Roberta, over to you. Maybe we've zoomed in a little bit. Now I'm hoping we can maybe zoom out and see, you know, take stock, analyze a little bit more, dive deeper into this very complex relationship. And you know, maybe if you could you know, try to identify some critical areas where the relationship could stand to improve. Thanks. No, click up.
Okay, now it's on, right? Thank you very much. Thank you for your invitation. I'm very happy to be here to celebrate your 40 years. Indeed, I'm wondering if you saw I put critical view on my paper.
I need glasses.
Okay. So yes, I want to, one of the other hats I wear, so I'm a professor of transatlantic relations, but I would say one of my main research areas is US foreign policy. So I think and this has been not very much mentioned, sort of a US point of view, and I guess I'll bring that out in the remarks that I want to make this morning. And indeed, I'll try to take a critical view. I recently wrote a chapter for an edited volume written by editors from two German scholars, Matthias Jopp and Johannes Pollack. And the title of this volume is The Lackluster World Power. And it's about EU foreign policy, or the European Union's geopolitics. And a title like that also, I guess, right away tells you what kind of contents this book is going to have. It'll come out sometime, I think, next year. I sent my chapter in the end of October. So the remarks that I'm going to say this morning derive from this chapter. And the first thing I want to talk about, and of course you gave me the same three questions. So this cooperation, how has it fared so far? And that's what I want to talk about first. And I want to focus on three concerns that have happened in EU, NATO cooperation, or transatlantic cooperation. And the first is the leadership problem. And this problem has bedeviled transatlantic relations since the Obama administration. But more recently, shifting geopolitical landscapes and the emergence of this new global challenges, and I want to make a list of those global challenges. So the energy crisis in Europe that you had, the rise of authoritarianism, it's also been mentioned by other speakers. We haven't mentioned the rise of populism. I think that's also very much a challenge, and certainly it's very clear it's also happening in the Netherlands with the last elections. Threats related to pandemics, vulnerabilities links to critical infrastructure, especially now those undersea cables in the Baltics. That's also a renewed threat, especially since the war, since Putin's invasion of Ukraine. But also pressures related to climate change. We mentioned that, Ruben Eric said that, and a general surge of global violence. I think we definitely see that in the recent past. But all of these are really undermining what was a traditional US leadership role in the Transatlantic Alliance. And I would then also say it also is undermining Europe's willingness to follow a US lead. So, but during the Obama administration, these factors, along with Obama's desire to step back from a leadership role, these resulted in a leadership vacuum, creating instability and uncertainty in the transatlantic relationship. We can credit Joe Biden for a commitment, certainly to take the lead on the Western campaign in supporting Ukraine, as well as fostering solidarity in the face of Putin's invasion. But the steady deliberations regarding the supply of tanks or other military assets to the Ukrainian army, which I think we can all see clearly needs more ammunition and heavy weaponry, I think these also highlight the alliance's cohesion is not guaranteed, nor also that US leadership is provisional, especially when you're given current possibilities for the next presidency. But I want to talk about the second issue now, and that is that one of capability, which you also mentioned. And this goes back as early as the early 1970s, when fairness and sharing the burdens for European defense first emerged in the transatlantic dialogue. And the current issue with capabilities is due to several factors. First, many European countries failed to meet their 2%. Secondly, the US is now more focused on security challenges in the Asia-Pacific region. Third, we also have new types of security threats, some that Peter also mentioned, like tactical nuclear weapons, cyber attacks, hybrid warfare. These will require new military capabilities and new approaches. And I think lastly here in this regard, the security environment in Europe has dramatically changed. New threats emerged due to Putin's invasion of Ukraine, renewed violence in the Middle East. All these things mean a very different security environment in Europe. Plus, this recent upsurge in violence has depleted stockpiles for both Americans and Europeans, and this puts further pressures on the capabilities and also a lot of competition. The third challenge that I want to mention that adds to Europe's undistinguished performance, its lackluster performance, as the book title says, as well as being an important concern in the transatlantic relationship, is the solidarity problem. And like the previous issues, it has several sources. Most prominently, the fact that there is a growing sense of disillusionment among European leaders and citizens regarding the United States' commitment to global leadership and the rules-based international order that it built after the Second World War. And certainly the Trump administration's America First foreign policy and its rejection of multilateralism has propelled this disillusionment. So the Biden administration, of course, attempted to engineer, one more thing. So we have these things going on with solidarity problem, but we have another problem, and that has to do with the Biden administration. Although I told you before we can commend him, we have to also wonder about his attempt to engineer a comparative advantage in economics through the Inflation Reduction Act, its CHIPS and Science Act, and its Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. These give Europeans the feeling that Biden pulled the rug out of his promised "we're back" multilateral foreign policy. Well, at least when it comes to free trade. Other factors that undermine transatlantic solidarity include divergent views on how to interact with China, how to address climate change, and how to deal with Iran. Well, at least during the Trump years, of how to deal with Iran. Domestic factors like increasing political polarization create pressures that further make it difficult to pursue a common transatlantic foreign policy agenda. So that's my answer to your first question. How am I doing on time? Okay, I want to go to the next question. So what are Europeans to do about it? So your question was, how may cooperation be further strengthened? That's what you asked me. And so my answer is, so what are Europeans to do? And in the chapter that I wrote, for each of these policy areas, or each of these policy issues that I mentioned, I give a whole series of answers. But I'm going to consolidate that and talk about 5 now. First, I think that Europeans need to understand, well, maybe this is a bit of comfort first. Europeans need to understand that US election campaigns can be boisterous, combative, and include a barrage of television ads, robocalls, partisan websites, mass mailings, and social media bots. Despite this onslaught, Americans wade through the electoral cycle rather well, so be comforted. As a recent economist pointed out, most Americans tend to view all campaign messages as spam. Thus, taking an optimistic view about the coming elections, it could be that most Americans will cast their votes guided by policy considerations and will support candidates dedicated to upholding traditional democratic values, including for revitalized commitment to justice, freedom, and alliances in Europe and in Asia, and not promise to be a dictator. Additionally, Europeans should take comfort that the US has been in this situation before. Americans' commitment to universal security and wrestling with its isolationist tendency is a recurrent post-war challenge. But more foreboding, I think we should also expect that transatlantic relations and NATO will be tested, especially if Trump wins in 2024. A second Trump administration means that the US remains deeply divided, potentially erratic, and might enter a new phase of isolationism. Although he's not widely trusted, in November 2019, Trump's former National Security Advisor, John Bolton, warned that if he was reelected, Trump would go, quote, fully isolated and withdraw the US from NATO. And it's comments like these that made more traditional Republicans and the Senate Formulations Committee introduce a bill to stop Trump from withdrawing from NATO. However, I'm sure that leaders here in Europe understand that a law preventing withdrawal from NATO could not guarantee the US's military support in a real crisis, such as Russia's invasions of the Baltics. An unwilling US commander-in-chief would still call into question the entire undergirding of the US-led NATO alliance. European leaders could let this knowledge that a Trump-led White House may not come to Europe's rescue spur a real appraisal of the transatlantic relationship and the management of their territorial defense. Third, and this applies to whoever is in the White House, European states should strengthen their leadership role, which involves reinforcing the idea that Americans and Europeans share a common purpose and maintain a strong strategic partnership. This also includes Europeans thinking about developing their grand strategy within the transatlantic partnership, one that could be built upon the premise of shared global governance. Such a partnership means together promoting democratic values, shared human rights goals, and earth-preserving priorities. It means together creating the conditions for principles of justice and human dignity. In their quest for a leadership position, Europeans should focus on their roles as a global standard bearer for democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. And they should see how this complements US leadership roles, US grand strategy, and US similar goals. Fourth, and this concerns the capabilities problem, European countries must make a clear commitment to invest in their capabilities and engage with other global powers on an equal footing. This starts with real movement to meet NATO commitments and to ensure sufficient resources and attention are devoted to addressing new security challenges like cyber attacks and hybrid warfare. The EU cannot be a meaningful actor on the world stage without military power. And it cannot defend itself without a real and significant investment in military strength. And to think otherwise, and I'm going to quote somebody who probably is very familiar to this audience, Sven Biskop, Sven says to argue otherwise is, quote, sheer nonsense. Moreover, Europeans should not play into the new isolationist campaign narrative by failing to spend enough on their own security and defense. This might be a while in coming, though, since the July 23 NATO summit in Vilnius. It was clear that many European member states still lag behind these 2% guidelines, as I mentioned before, which the economists pointed out was to the annoyance of America. And fifth, European countries must work to enhance their military integration and cooperation, both within NATO and with other European partners, working towards multinational formations. This includes strengthening military planning and coordination, as well as developing joint military capabilities and joint procurement of defense systems. Enhanced military integration and cooperation will help address the military capabilities problem that I already mentioned and strengthen the collective defense in Europe. Which leads me to my last part. What could undermine cooperation in the next 40 years is what you asked me. And this last point that I make also, I think, is still will be very much a factor that undermines cooperation. I could name several factors, but I'm going to stick to two. And the first has to do with this, what I just last mentioned, but also very much echoes what Ruben Eric says. Yes, about spending more and spending better. And I do think that's a really important point that deals with the competition within the industries here within Europe, but also the fragmentation, the duplication of uncoordinated military structures that I mentioned before. And these are problems that the CSDP has really had from its inception. And I think they are a problem now, and I think they will still be something to overcome in the future. We still have 27 armies, and the personnel from these 27 armies, the 27 air forces, the 20 navies, these absorb significant portion of the outlays that members spend for security and defense. Also, EU militaries have 178 weapon systems, and if you compare that to the US's 30, you can see there are some problems there in the fragmentation. There's also 17 different tank models, as an example, compared to the US's 1. So these things, this fragmentation, duplication, these are real problems that will bedevil the future. So a lack of interoperability, all these things for weapon systems, these equal inefficiency that really needs to be overcome. Duplication is wasteful and expensive. EU member states need to improve their pooling, sharing, and specializing of resources to prevent the improper use of funds. PESCO, which you might mention, I'm assuming. This is collaboration between 25 member states. This is one answer to the problems that I've been mentioning. But I think that PESCO also has some predictable impediments. I could mention several. I'm not going to do that for time. If you want to ask me that later, I can also answer those things. But I think there's some impediments to PESCO that hinders cooperation between the EU member states and has resulted in maybe some stalled movement forward. So that's my first issue for the next 40 years. My second one, and the last point that I'm going to make, is Ukraine, which has already been mentioned, echoing again Ruben Eric. Ukraine needs a steady flow of economic and military aid to keep up its fight against Russia. And now I heard this morning on BBC World Service, or BBC News, that IMF has come through for it. But from the US perspective, this aid seems to be drying up. Congress at the moment cannot agree on how to get it started again. The Biden administration finds itself in a thorny political headache over a major new national security funding bill to keep the aid to Ukraine flowing. It's complicated by the impasse in Congress on what to do about the US southern border. Supporters of Ukraine in the US Congress are giving a stark warning to everybody. If US aid doesn't start flowing again, or if some aid doesn't start flowing again, Putin could win the war. Putin, of course, is counting on diminishing solidarity that I've talked about for Ukraine, for global issues, either through Trump's re-election or through general Ukraine fatigue. Putin knows that democracies more easily tire of a fight and that a Western public can be coaxed into an unwillingness to suffer because of war on someone else's doorstep. But I'll end on something positive. The West is richer than Russia. It has a greater industrial capacity to make the instruments for its defense and its security, including the defense and security of Ukraine. And I think that together, the US and the EU could harness their advantages and their potential to develop co-capabilities. It just now needs the leadership on both sides to fulfill these goals. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Roberta. And I'm wondering now, Guillaume, you have an added task, right? Because you had your lines to take, and now you've received the input of three further panelists whose comments I suppose you will interact with. We have at least 6 issues that Roberta raised, and you have maximum 7 to 10 minutes to really address problems of leadership, capabilities, solidarity, fragmentation, duplication. I mean, there's a lot on the table. Excuse me. There's a lot on the table here, and it seems now that the picture is much less rosy than it was when we began.
Thank you, Dylan. And it looks as rosy as it was presented by Ruben at the beginning to me. I'm very happy to be here. I'm Guillaume. I'm dealing with EU-NATO relations in the European External Action Service. I'm very happy to be in CEPS. I also have, I turned 39 last Sunday, and realizing that this institution is older than me helps me understand the magnitude of its contribution to European thinking, and congratulations for that. And I'm very happy to see you, Dylan. We've been working together, and it's a pleasure to be here today with this fantastic set of panelists. Of course, there's a gender-responsive logic to my request to close, but it's not the only, let's say, reason behind. There's also a sort of rhetorical blitzkrieg that NATO and the European Union are carrying out here, because we open with rosy pictures and we close with fireworks. So it's also a way to integrate think tank and academia into our fantastic transatlantic unity. Having said that, EU-NATO cooperation is a key pillar of the EU reinforced efforts in the field of security and defense. It is in the treaty as such. It's acknowledged its role, but not only as Ruben pointed out, it also appears in our respective strategic documents. The strategic compass actually says that only gives 2 regional or international organizations that are strategic partners, and one of them is NATO, the other is the UN. You know that the European Union's been during the last years trying to build up its profile in security and defense matters. You mentioned, many of you, the unique toolbox that we have been developing is to become an effective peace enabler, a reliable security provider, and a stronger and capable defense actor. And as I said, in this context, EU-NATO cooperation is key, and the current geopolitical context, and I have to disagree here, and I'm reacting in a flexible manner to interventions by other speakers, I don't think that undermines cooperation. On the contrary, it has fostered cooperation. And I think that what I will say onwards will reflect how I agree to disagree. But even before, since, as Ruben said as well, it looks like we are jointly drafting speeches as well. Since 2018, 2016, 2018, and 2023, joint declarations clearly state the degree of increased cooperation among 2 organizations. It has given clearly a new political impetus beyond the archaeology efforts that we can do and go backwards as much as we want. But most recently, this transatlantic unity has been particularly displayed. In 2023, in the joint declaration earlier this year, the Russia's unjustified war of aggression against Ukraine has been considered as the gravest threat to Euro-Atlantic security. It gives us a common pillar of action in these days. But it also acknowledges, and this is important for the European Union, of course, that recognizes the value of a stronger and more capable European defense. And also, again, I use the occasion to slightly react. We have a principle of single set of forces among our more and more converging allyship and membership, and precisely this joint declaration attributes these logics of interoperable and complementary. So this is the very logics of our partnership and the driving force that I will hope the audience will keep in this blitzkrieg I'm trying to develop. Finally, this joint declaration, what it does is to say that we are bringing our relation to the next level. It's not only about the 74 actions, but it's about how we not only we have an ocean of knowledge, is that we are going into depth in a complementary manner. As it has been mentioned by Pinet, our joint reports are very clear and public and available and very detailed on what we do. But let me just mention the overarching umbrella, which is the political dialogue. We do have 3 layers. So first is cross briefings. In order to prepare this presentation, we checked, and since 2016, it's more than 250 cross briefings between EU and NATO respective staffs to respective allyships and memberships, and this shows the degree of interaction, transparency, and openness between us. Only this year it's 68 the number, so it's a record in our cooperation. So it shows a positive increased trend of mutual penetration and understanding of each other. Then at political level, cross-participation in high-level events. Only in November, the HRVP was in NATO for the Foreign Ministerial. The Secretary General participated in an informal breakfast and it has also been mentioned, the importance of it on critical infrastructures. NATO Secretary General attended the college. It's clear that what has been called like a leadership problem. I mean, as a diplomat, I'm not entitled to say problem, I only say challenge, I think. And I don't see not even the challenge, not even the concern. I think that on the contrary, they are seeing each other more than I can see my counterparts in NATO. So they keep on talking constantly and addressing jointly the challenges to the Euro-Atlantic security. Of course, there's also the third layer of political dialogue, which is PSC exchanges at the ambassadorial level, be it in a formal setting for Althea or in other informal settings for other issues. But again, Ukraine has brought us to another level. I was joking with my team because we always say this, and I also told Roberta, we say rock solid unity. And I have here a number of synonyms have been given by my team. It's ironclad, unshakable, unwavering, impenetrable, as hard as a stone. So it means that we do have a joke about it because we are constantly saying, and we are constantly saying it because it's, as you said, Dylan, at the beginning, one of the strongest bilateral organization-to-organization relations that exist. And this should not be diminished. Of course, there might be challenges, but this is only room for improvement that we keep on covering with our increasing and developed a partnership. We have provided coordinated responses to the Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine. Of course, in these complementary logics, NATO strengthening its deterrence and collective defense, and the EU displaying its whole unique toolbox, is isolating Russia politically, diplomatically, constraining it economically, financially, and also providing economic and humanitarian support to Ukraine. And last but not least, we are also for the first time providing military support to Ukraine. So I think this is an important step forward that the European Union has taken, and it should be acknowledged, including in this context. However, EU-NATO cooperation is given the membership political constraints. It's focused on the staff cooperation. Ideally, we would evolve to an organization with more interaction among members and allies. And And actually this is happening through the new accession processes. But while this builds up, what we need to do is to keep on reinforcing our staff-to-staff cooperation. In the case of Ukraine, I'm very happy to co-chair the staff coordination mechanism. That it's, I was telling Ruben, I mean, the number of areas in which we coordinate is so wide. That goes from strategic communications to energy matters, covering demining. It's an impressive set of areas in which we coordinate, and I'm very happy to see that my role as head of the division dealing with EU-NATO cooperation is that I need to keep track of all experts' direct work, and I'm not always managing because it's so wide and so deep that it's impressive. This is why these mechanisms of coordination are so useful as well. But however, in order to do that and bring forward our cooperation between staff to staff, we should reinforce even further our framework. We think that the 74 common actions provide a great basis and have provided a great basis. Now what we aim is at updating it, streamlining it and reviewing it with a view at having a comprehensive framework document that enables our staff to have a single document encompassing the full spectrum of this so wide and deep cooperation. Of course, and also jumping on remarks by Piret, we do have a particular interest in reinforcing new areas such as resilience. Climate and defense has also been mentioned. It's an area where the European Union has been also stepping up its efforts, emerging and disruptive technologies, and of course space, but these also include certainly hybrid, cyber, and resilience of critical infrastructure. Again, for me, I can only conclude saying that in the current context, with all this track of increased cooperation, I can only be optimistic and give you a rosy picture. I have been trying to soften the concerns raised by others, and I look forward to do that in the remaining time we have, which is not much. Apologies, I was long. Just a final message to send that transatlantic unity is even more imperative today than ever.
Thank you, Guillaume. And of course, I have many questions on what you just said, especially kind of slipping in the reference to some sort of comprehensive but single document that provides an overview of future common actions to undertake. I think that would reflect very nicely the EU's motto, unity in diversity, correct? Having one united document with very diverse portfolios within it. That being said, we have a lot of firepower in the room. And so I would like to turn it over to them instead to ask their questions, maybe provoke our panelists a little bit more in the next 10 to 12 minutes before we wrap it up for a coffee break before our second session. So perhaps, Linus, could you help me with the roaming mic? Could you take Piret's mic on the end in case anybody's interested in taking questions? Just raise your hand, don't be shy. Yes, the gentleman in the second row here. We'll take 2 or 3 questions.
Yeah, thank you very much, and thanks for 4 very interesting presentations, which at least gave me a lot of new ideas and thoughts. I'm not a military expert, not at all, and therefore my question is concerning...
Could you introduce yourself briefly? Could you introduce yourself?
My name is Francis, and I'm a former EU official, and now basically independent observer. But my question comes from the public finance side, and it's to you, Ruben. It's do you have sort of an idea about what is the upper limit of defense expenditures that we need in the NATO context? Because when you look at the raw figures, we are outspending Russia with a very large amount of money, and therefore it sort of begs the question, how much more do we need in order to match the needs to counter Russia and the aggression? Or is it that we are already now preparing for other threats, And that's why we see a need for further expenditures. And if that's the case, then should we not be clear about the other threats that we actually are trying to counter already now? Thank you.
Any others? Yes.
Hello, my name is Byung Jo from Korea Institute for Defense Analysis. I really enjoyed the talks today. My question is the following. As I observe, EU and NATO are both expanding to the area of Indo-Pacific, Asia-Pacific. And listening to you all today, it seems like the imperatives are there, but you have a lot of problems to solve within EU and NATO. So I would like to hear your thoughts on whether expanding is the new glue of these relations or not. Thank you.
Yeah, and maybe also setting the stage for the discussion later. One more question, or even two if there are takers.
Robert Cox, former EU Commission official. Our friend from Oxford touched quite well on one of the major issues, which is domestic politics inside both the EU and in NATO. And I found her presentation of what's happening or may happen in the United States very fascinating indeed. We possibly are underestimating the degree of political uncertainty, if not chaos, present to a very high degree inside the European Union at the moment. And of course, its offshore friend, the United Kingdom, which seems to be having a particular chaos. France is wobbly. Germany is wobbly. Elections coming up in Belgium, very dubious about what's happening. Spanish government with the problems over Catalonia. 2 member states who are possibly closer to Moscow than they are to Brussels. Poor Mr. Tusk is going to have a pretty rough time, I suspect, in trying to put his authority to work in Poland, and so on and so on. It seems to me that in terms of talking to public opinion, we've got a large amount of domestic electoral issues and problem areas which we have to face up to. Not just weapons, not just standardization, but political dialogue with public opinion about the value of the transatlantic relationship. Thank you.
Yeah, just one fourth question. It's the fourth and final, so if anyone really wants to sneak one in, now is your chance.
David Clark, former EIB official and King's College student. My comment follow on for the last question, and relates to a seminar I went to Chatham House on Moldova and what the Russians are doing in Moldova to destabilize and subvert the democratic process. And I think this has much wider implications. One could talk a lot about it. One comment was made was that the UK spends as much as the whole of the European Union countering Russian destabilization. We did hear a bit about proactive cyber thing. I think I've always been a friend of Russia, but I realize now we have to take our gloves off and we have to counter Russian destabilization fiercely. And one final point, it's much cheaper than military hardware, if I could put it there. Thank you.
All right, last chance. Okay. Many questions to answer. So maybe I could ask you to pick and choose which questions apply to your remarks, because some were directed at some panelists in particular, and mix them in with your final closing remarks as well before we wrap things up. And so maybe we go in reverse order of what my originally intended order was going to be. So beginning with Roberta, and then Piret, then Guillaume, then Ruben. Roberta, go ahead.
Thank you very much for your interesting questions. I'm going to answer two of them. And the first one has to do with your question on, is expanding to the Asia-Pacific the new glue? And I'm going to say no. And the reason I say that is AUKUS, for one. Because, of course, AUKUS is, there's only a few member states, well, the UK was part of the overall European and transatlantic security, but of course no longer part of the European Union. And so that was negotiated without the EU, and of course France, which had this deal for submarines, said it was a stab in the back. I also was once, before all this, I was at the NATO Defense College in Rome, and I gave a lecture there, and then there was a nice lunch, and then I talked to the senior French official there, and he quite clearly said to me, NATO has no role in Asia. No role. If Taiwan becomes vulnerable, NATO has no role there. And I was surprised by that, by the strength of that argument. And I said, well, that's interesting. Would you have ever said that NATO had a role in Afghanistan? Which it clearly did. So I think that the divisions or the uncertainties, maybe that has moved on a little bit, I'm not sure. But I don't think that, and there's certainly lots of disagreements of how to deal with China. We didn't talk about, I talked about the US trying to engineer economic comparative advantage, but of course that's also, part of that is also reaching out to companies like ASML in the Netherlands and saying, please, you have to, we won't allow you to sell your machines that help with the highest level of chip making. And also to Japan, same sort of thing. So the US is leveraging its ability, the ability that it has to have its partners not to do what it would like, also within the whole chip and economic rivalry with China. But I'm not sure that Europeans want to go along with that, and I think that certainly it's not very clear that the Dutch will maintain that ban. So I would say there is more disagreement than glue at the moment. That's my answer to that. Secondly, I'm going to ask about the domestic politics, and I think you're entirely right, and I sort of mentioned that, and I do think that we're underestimating the rise of populism, and I do think this very much ties in with leadership problems, that we indeed don't value, that leaders today do not communicate to publics the value of the Transatlantic Alliance. And it's too easy for so many politicians to use the wedge issues, grievances, fear of migrants. It's too easy for them to do that for their own political gain. And I think we see that across, certainly in the US we see that. We're seeing that in Western Europe. Certainly they're seeing that now in the Netherlands, that there are certainly all these fears about the other. And people, yes, we want to have more checkpoints, but then not realizing that those checkpoints mean that Schengen will be under pressure. So you have politicians who are saying one side of the argument for political gain, which then maybe propels them into political office, but then undermines the whole fabric of the Transatlantic Alliance or even the unity within Europe. And I think we need to have leaders who are willing to be honest, but also have a good convincing voice to say that what we have is really very important, and that find ways to build this in trust building. Okay, I'll end it there. Otherwise I'm taking too much time.
Thanks, Roberta. Over to you, Piret.
I take all three questions from cybersecurity point of view. So regarding cooperation with Indo-Pacific partners, I would say this has been ongoing for a long time. Both EU has a cyber dialogue, and those countries are essential partners as like-minded partners for us. So I don't think there's any concern in terms of dealing with our own issues. And so the second question regarding domestic political issues and uncertainty and chaos, as you know, everything from geopolitical competition environment translate into cyber domain. So, of course, we do have national interests concerning protecting internal market and so on. For example, you can see right now those discussions in the framework of the draft Cyber Solidarity Act, and questions whether the trusted provider should be able to offer services in the language of this country. So, which kind of limits the other countries to participate. And but I think we can overcome those, and it's also the more we build trust, the less maybe we are concerned about protectionist interests. But still, there is of course, ongoing discussion regarding the strategic autonomy and what it means in cyberspace and digital domain. So, and lastly, a question about Moldova and Ukraine. There is cooperation. Both organizations are very active, also in terms of resilience and disinformation in the field, and they are cooperating. But I think you can share more light on this, what's exactly happening there. But broadly speaking, of course, when we look at the donors in general in cyber capacity building, there is a lot of duplication, and there are probably some streamlining would make more efficient approach. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, so some see challenges and some see opportunities. Guillaume, over to you for your final words.
Thank you. I will be complementary and interoperable, and I will I will mention the Moldova reference. I mean, only last week, the Deputy Secretary General of NATO and of the European External Action Service, the Secretary General of the EAS, agreed in the context of developing capabilities of partners to step up efforts of both organizations in order to support Moldova. So let's say the momentum you flag has been seized by our leaderships. The European Union only this year has created the new CSDP mission in Moldova. We are engaging then also more widely in the terms of Stratcom and fight against disinformation. We do have a security and defense dialogue with Moldova that we just held last week. So very timely question. We are stepping up our efforts in support of that partner country. I will not enter the public opinion list of le cahier de doléances of all national realities. Of course, the lines between national domestic politics and international are more and more blurred, and this is not new, and it does not only apply to EU-NATO cooperation. But what I think it's important that we mention, because when we think about domestic politics, it's about what national leaders do in order to convince and co-opt their public opinions, is that their public opinions, at least the European Union ones, are saying that they want a stronger European Union and that they want a stronger European Union that steps up on security and defense, which is precisely what in our joint efforts are doing together, and it's fully acknowledged by NATO. So I see room for hope, even if I understand that there are also gloomy forecasts. Because we are running out of time, I will just leave it there.
Thank you. Yeah, and yeah, that it is interesting on the polling, because recent polling also has shown that in many EU member states, general public is less convinced about the functioning of EU-level democracy than they have been in the past, and so of course. Yeah, exactly. This would be another panel, but it's quite interesting. Ruben, over to you for the final word. Keeping in mind Roberta's comments about how challenges in the EU-US relationship might creep into the EU-NATO one.
Yes, thanks, Dylan, and a lot of good questions and really a great panel. So thanks to you and to CEPS again for the invitation. Look, I'll try to address a couple of the points that came up from the floor. I think, and they indirectly also maybe help us with Roberta's points. I think on the question around defense spending, this is obviously key for us, as I mentioned before. A priority is maintaining that steady flow of resources, the investment in defense that we require to underpin the credibility of our collective defense and deterrence. And there is a relatively good story to tell. I mean, I think in this year alone, defense expenditure by European allies and Canada have increased by 8.3%, which is the biggest increase in decades. Since 2014, since the first attack on Ukraine by Russia, allies have invested an extra $450 billion in defense. Now, sir, your question was whether we have a total ceiling or a limit. I mean, we do not. At the same time, allies at the Vilnius summit reconfirmed that they believe that we need to make an enduring commitment to invest at least 2% of GDP annually in defense, and in some cases even more, given the dangerous situation that we face in Europe today and also in the current world environment. Furthermore, I'd say that that it's 2%. Yes, you could say okay, quantity, but what about quality? I think more and more as NATO's defense, its new baseline in terms of defense develops and matures, we have an increasingly detailed picture of what is needed from allies. We have, since the Vilnius summit, agreed a set of overarching regional plans for collective defense. This, my military colleagues assure me, articulates a whole logic as to who should be doing what, when, and where, with what capabilities and what formations, using what command structure, using what investments to support. So I think that that is gives a very good sense of what we need to be investing in the years to come. So on that's on the defense spending question. On Indo-Pacific, I think that we need to be somewhat accurate with our words. Expanding to the Indo-Pacific is perhaps is not the verb I would use. I think we have enlarged our cooperation within the Pacific, and that is very much clear. We have been very privileged to have heads of state and government from the 4 Indo-Pacific partners at 2 summits in a row now, at Madrid and at Vilnius, which has allowed us to deepen that political cooperation. We've had cooperation also in other formats, ministerial, chiefs of defense, and a very robust agenda of cooperation has been agreed for NATO and those 4 partners collectively, but also individually in bilateral tailored relationships with those countries. And the reason for that is not that we are expanding in the Pacific, it's that NATO remains a European, North American regional alliance for security, but we do see that our security is global, that there are challenges and threats that come to us from the global level, and that we have to understand what it means to respond to these, what it means to work together with this, and that's why we derive such value and importance from that relationship within the Pacific. In fact, that's something that's also underlined in the strategic concept from last year, that NATO has an interest and has a fundamental interest in the Pacific as a region for the alliance. Partly also, for the reasons that we all know. I mean, the commercial relationship, the political relationship between the two regions is very, very strong. So I think that's clear. Then finally, on the issue of domestic politics has come up. Like Guillaume, I'm not going to wade into those waters because I don't think it would be appropriate for me. But I think that we need to be aware in this moment of strategic competition of the fact that adversaries and competitors are interfering, they are using coercive mechanisms, they are using all manner of ways to malign information, manipulation, and other cyber attacks and other forms of actions to sort of artificially widen divides, to amplify polarization. So that, I think, points to the fundamental importance of taking resilience seriously as nation states, as EU, as NATO, to ensure that the legitimate democratic process does not get undermined or disturbed by these efforts to manipulate and to basically destroy this process. So I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
Thank you, Ruben, and thank you to all of our panelists today for their really thought-provoking remarks. I'm sure I benefited from the discussion. I hope that you did as well in the audience. With that, I'd like to wrap things up and send those who are leaving on their way, whether it is by bike or by, by foot. There is a strike today. For those who would like to stay, there's a coffee break in the room downstairs. So thank you very much and see you soon.
Hello? Oh, there I am. Oh, good Lord. Sorry, I didn't realize that. Anyway, we've begun to attack the subject of the Indo-Pacific in the previous session, and we're going to now drill down on some of these issues with the panel that we have now. My name is Jim Moran. I'm a research fellow here in CEPS. We have a very good lineup of speakers. I'll introduce them in just a minute. And for me, just a personal reflection on the 40 years, I arrived in Brussels 40 years ago to the day. It seems like yesterday. And one of the first things I learned when I came to Brussels is that NATO is over there and we are over here, and never the twain should meet. Don't speak to NATO officials, I was told. This is in 1983. We were far, far, far apart back then. 25 years later, I joined João Barroso, the president of the Commission, at the Budapest, the famous Budapest summit of NATO then. And in fact, I was asked as the sort of backup for Barroso, we were there for Afghanistan, of course, asked for the backup by somebody, I think it was a senior UK official who must remain nameless. He said, "What on earth is Mr. Barroso doing here?" It was, in fact, the first time that a president of the Commission was actually invited to a NATO summit. The reflection on that is that if it was to happen today, 15 years after that, the question would be, where is President Barroso? So an extraordinary change in cooperation between the two institutions over that period of time. And I think it's reflected in what we heard in the first session as well, an awful lot of coalition of interests, also some difficulties. Anyway, we're now going to look at the Indo-Pacific region. And of course, China, not only China, but especially China, has been rising up the agenda for NATO. It's been on top of the agenda for the EU for a long time. It poses a number of questions. I think while the, I suppose you might call it heightened concern about China in EU and NATO circles is natural, especially given its no limits, so-called no limits partnership with Russia and what that means for the war in Ukraine. The question there would be, is there a danger, especially for NATO, that its engagement in the region, the Indo-Pacific region, would provoke China into even stronger support for its Eurasian neighbor? And seen from the European viewpoint, there are certainly a number of doubts. President Macron at some point, I think, had warned about NATO's, not expansion, we heard it wasn't expansion, NATO's new engagement in the region. He described it as being a possible trap for Europe. And of course, there are differing interests when it comes to the EU, and particularly the US, and by extension NATO in the area, perhaps. That said, and although the EU has a limited role in any force projection in the region, it does, of course, have very important legitimate security interests there. Just to name one or two, and I think the panel will hopefully get into some of these, keeping the sea lanes open, perhaps first and foremost, especially given the extraordinary commercial relationships that we have, not only with China, but throughout the region these days. And I'm speaking there also about Japan, about Korea, about ASEAN, Oceania, and of course, Taiwan as well. We have an interest very strong in contributing to the fight against nuclear proliferation, especially when it comes to North Korea and everything that difficult country gets up to. And not least, there is the question of political cooperation with like-minded democracies and civil society in the region. So we've heard a lot about the burgeoning cooperation. Let's see how it plays out in the Indo-Pacific region. We're going to start with Nicholas Granstrom, who is the fairly new Managing Director for Asia-Pacific in the European External Action Service. And I'll introduce the other speakers as we go along. I hope we'll have about a half an hour at the end for Q&A, so hold on for your questions, all very welcome. Over to you, Nicholas, if you can take us into the subject. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me just, does this work? Turning it on. Oh, there we go. Well, thank you very much for having me on the panel. And indeed, very new in this job, already getting some new gray hair in the job, but it's a very important task. I came to the job from having more or less the same function in the Swedish Foreign Service, and before that, ambassador to Singapore for Sweden. I want to say just one thing about the Indo-Pacific and its importance for the European Union to start us off, and that is that if you look at the future prosperity, the future security, the future economic development and trade of the European Union, this region is incredibly important. I think it's something like the way that the EU defines the Indo-Pacific, it's something like 60% of the global population, 60% of the GDP, and 60% of, for example, greenhouse gas emissions. These are all, I've rounded them in a wonderful way to be able to say 60, 60, 60, but something like that. So for our future, if you look at the waterways, if you think of this almost banana-shaped region from our perspective, and particularly from a maritime perspective, that's a lot of our trade, a lot of our future prosperity, and a lot of security issues to the point of this panel that will affect the future of the European Union. The strategy that we adopted in 2021 is very useful because it helps us to sort of package and provide a framework to keep track of all the ways that we build our partnerships, build our influence in this crucial region for us. You could say, I think the strategy has 7 pillars, but you could really simplify it into 3 sort of baskets. One is pertaining to trade and connectivity and digitalization and so on. One that is focused on climate change and green transition and environment. And then one that really is security and, including, let's not forget, human security. So those 3 areas, I think, what's interesting about them is that they are the keys for us to grow and prosper in the future. They happen to be key areas for our partners in the region as well. And so we are trying our best to build these partnerships and to show the offer that the EU can provide. And the offer in question is one that is based on free trade, based on rule of law, based on sustainable development, based on respect. The EU is an actor that has no hidden agenda and is a natural partner for many of these countries. We also live in a world that is geopolitically, in a geopolitical sensitive state where there's geopolitical competition. There are also forces working on extreme sides to divide us, divide the developed world from the developing world, divide groups of people from each other. And it's really, really important for the European Union to show that we are a force for working together on the key challenges that we have. Now, on security, there's actually been a lot of development, I think, in this area, not just since the adoption of the strategy, but since the EU started in 2016 and 2018 through Council conclusions and a strategy to talk about the Indo-Pacific. The most simple thing is, of course, naval exercises. That's a very concrete physical manifestation. We've done that with joint naval exercises with some of our key partners, India, Indonesia, Japan, the Republic of Korea, and the United States. We also have something called the CMP, the Coordinated Maritime Presence, which is an attempt, because the European Union and its member states, is a complex actor, but to coordinate and keep track of the maritime presence that we have, and particularly it's been the case in the Northwest Indian Ocean. We are working on, as has been published during the summits, on security agreements with Japan and the Republic of Korea, some of our closest partners in the region. And we have a couple of key initiatives. One is called ESIWA, which promotes security-related cooperation projects in the region, and Climario, which is really a maritime domain awareness platform. In parallel with that, we'd like to keep the strands together, not just to talk about that sort of hard security, but also weave in some of the, you could say that if you're talking about sustainable development, you're talking about economic development, and you're talking about security, those are very much interlinked in the world we live today. So we try to do that through the Indo-Pacific Ministerial Forum. We had one in Paris, we had one in Stockholm that we hosted when we had the Swedish presidency in my old job, and we have one coming up in February here in Brussels as well. And that's really an attempt to show the convening power of the EU, to bring together these actors. I think the main takeaway is that we act together. This is a huge group of countries that can really set standards for the sort of development we want. Then, of course, in this region, there are some very, very concrete security concerns. There is, and it's not a coincidence when you talk about NATO. I think I was in in my previous job in a conference in Lithuania on NATO, Indo-Pacific dialogue, I think, in cooperation. Not a surprise that we always end up talking about cyber issues, we talk about hybrid threats, we talk about FEMI and disinformation and so on. And I think that's because even, and I will not comment on NATO since I'm representing the EU, but I think even for an organization that defines itself very, very strictly geographically, we live in a world today where these threats are transnational, they are global, they don't know borders. You can be focusing on your area, but the threat that you're facing can emanate from somewhere very, very far away. And so what we need to do is to shore up support for basic principles and work together. Then there are the regional hotspots, of course, you mentioned them, of course, Jim, but starting with in Asia Pacific, my area, we should remember that the way that the EU defines the Indo-Pacific is broader than Asia Pacific. It also includes the coast, the east coast of Africa and part of the Middle East, or what the Indian Foreign Secretary calls West Asia. But for us, of course, you mentioned Taiwan. Of course, that is a clear area where the threat, the tensions have risen, and we have all seen through various reports that the consequences would be enormous also for the European Union of a miscalculation, of an open conflict. There is what's going on as we speak in the South China Sea. You see the regional tensions there. These are key waterways. This is a matter of, for the European Union, of standing up also for international law, and UNCLOS in particular. You mentioned, I think in your intro here, you said the Korean Peninsula. It's, I could say in my previous job that we had 70 years of Swedish military presence on the border between North and South Korea. Not the same guys, in case you're wondering. You know, they do get changed. But to show you that there are conflicts that are unresolved, and we see with the development of the missiles, on the nuclear program and so on, how dangerous this is. And it has, of course, a potential massive impact, not just on trade and economics, but most of all on human lives. So these are serious concerns for us in the region. There are others. I haven't even gone into the Indian Ocean. But just to say that these are things that the European Union has a legitimate interest to raise with our partners in the region. And to that point, just came back on Saturday from the EU-China summit in Beijing, and part of the discussion there, I mean, the main points of discussion was to talk about some of our economic imbalances. That is something that the European Union has to do. You just have to look at the trade deficit to understand why, but also to talk about concrete things that we can cooperate on in, let's say, climate change area for one, but then also some of these conflict areas in the world. And unfortunately, we live in a time where we are faced by a war on our own continent, in our own house, so to say. And we came with very, very concrete messages on Russia's illegal, brutal war of aggression against Ukraine. And I think it's very, very important for the European Union as a geopolitical actor to have that conversation with China and others. And we are not shy about also explaining to China that on issues like the South China Sea or Taiwan for that matter, these are of direct concern to us. They are not issues that should be rest in isolation, and we are not supposed to have views on it. There's the Middle East, the ongoing conflict there, and that is something that, again, between global actors like China and the EU, it's important to compare positions, try to urge our partners to act in ways that we would like them to do. And that is, and so I will leave it with a final note just to say that in all of this, to the point of this panel, I think the last one, what we have to do is find partnerships. And that is why, whether it's the EU's economic security strategy or the Indo-Pacific strategy, the focus is on building partnerships in the region, not just with fully like-minded, I think, countries, but with countries where we can work on concrete issues and agendas going forward. So that's what we're trying to do.
Thank you, Nicholas. Just one question, if I may. You're just back from China. You know the place pretty well. There are elections coming in Taiwan very soon. How would you assess the level of concern, nervousness in mainland China now about those elections?
Look, I think what I will say in a public forum like this, without going into the details of the discussions of the summit, is that we are all very much aware of the potential. I think beyond the election period in the process of government formation. Given, if you look back in history, I myself studied in Taiwan in 1995 when there was the so-called Third Straits crisis. That there's a huge potential for increased tensions and tensions that could lead to miscalculations. And of course, our job is to urge the parties to not raise tensions, and specifically no coercion. No, we will not accept a coerced or violent change of the status quo. So I'd probably leave it at that, but I think you can imagine that the positions of the Chinese very clear on that. We are equally clear on the tensions point. We have a one China policy that we stand by, but we also have a very advanced economic and so on relationship with Taiwan, and we have to think about our own security and about our own economic development, which could be impacted. So following it closely, having dialogue with our partners, and of course also with the Chinese side.
Well, thank you. Let's move on. And next up is Catherine Pegg, who is a senior fellow with the Australia Chair at the Centre for Strategic and International Studies over there in Washington. Catherine, perhaps you can give us the view on this from across the pond.
Is this on? Great. Thank you so much, and thanks for having me, and congrats to CEPS for 40 years of fantastic work. It's really a pleasure to be here and on such a distinguished panel. That's exactly what I was planning on doing, so I'm glad I was introduced in that manner. Prior to escaping from the government and making it to think tank world this summer, I was working in the current administration at the National Security Council as the director for Southeast Asia and the Pacific. So I can speak a little bit to the way we have been approaching from the US perspective some of the expanded engagement in the Indo-Pacific, and more broadly the engagement with partners and allies across the world in that way. First of all, I think this is an incredibly relevant topic, and it's such a pleasure to see this as part of this event, the discussion of European security and defense in the Indo-Pacific. I think current events certainly have reinforced this to anyone that was not already convinced of this fact. From the US perspective, I think the idea that there's individual theaters is really quite antiquated, and something that we are starting to look at a real connectivity between regions and between theaters in terms of what affects one affects others. And it's already been brought up, not just in the cyber domain, economics, food supply, supply chains. These are all connecting us globally, and what happens in one place affects what happens everywhere else. This has certainly been the case for Indo-Pacific countries when they look at the war in Ukraine and Russia's invasion there, and how that has affected the food supply and the economies of the Indo-Pacific. It's also been something that many Indo-Pacific countries have looked at in terms of Russia's invasion, perhaps setting a precedent for other large countries to do the same. And so it is being keenly watched, and why we see so much interest and involvement from our Indo-Pacific partners. So as the U.S. has looked, as was mentioned by one of the previous panelists, President Biden has tried to make a big push back in the partners and allies domain. There's, of course, mixed reviews on that across the board, but I would argue that there has been a significant push, especially in the Indo-Pacific, when it comes to raising the Quad to the leader level, the formation of AUKUS, really an unprecedented initiative, and several other initiatives, and also a re-engagement at the level with ASEAN in Southeast Asia, the Pacific Islands Forum in Oceania, and these forums that we're seen as really critical to engage. But a key part of this strategy has also been engaging partners and allies beyond the Indo-Pacific, in the Indo-Pacific, really because of a recognition that we are all better when we're working together and in alignment, and the US, for all its size and weight, certainly cannot go it alone in any one area. This is really exemplified when we look at the Pacific, one of my areas of specialty. The Pacific Islands, when we say the Pacific in the US, we mean the Pacific Islands. The members of the 18 Pacific Islands Forum members, and includes Australia and New Zealand. As the US has significantly increased our engagement over the last few years, including 2 leader-level summits in Washington, D.C., completely unprecedented, a first-ever U.S. strategy on the Pacific. A key piece of this was incorporating our work with other partners and allies, again, beyond the Pacific. We created a new initiative called the Partners in the Blue Pacific, which some people may be tracking if you're Pacific watchers. And this initiative includes members from Europe. We have the UK and Germany as former members, and the EU and France are observers in the PBP, as we call it, the Partners in the Blue Pacific. This is met up at the foreign ministerial level. EU and European voices have been really critical as we look at how we want to engage and do more in the Pacific. A key example of this was a maritime domain awareness conference that we held earlier this year in January in Hawaii, where we had representatives from all 18 Pacific Island Forum members, Pacific Island key fora such as the Pacific Fusion Center, FFA, the Fisheries Association, and the Secretariat, as well as all PBP members and observers. So the EU sent 2 representatives to sit at the table for that 2-day discussion, very in-depth conversation over the maritime domain awareness challenges facing so much of the Pacific with regard to illegal fishing, maintaining the sovereignty of their vast EEZs across the region. And EU representatives had some really key insights on both maritime domain awareness capabilities and ways that we could be working together to sync some of our efforts in the region. So a main focus of the PBP has been both avoiding redundancies that often happen by having numerous partners in a region with very small capacity governments, but also ensuring that we are able to fill the gaps that are needed. But I think when we look at the Indo-Pacific, I certainly don't need to explain to Europe why the Indo-Pacific matters. That's already been laid out several times. I think, going back to what was mentioned in the previous panel by Roberta, actually, thank you for some of your wonderful comments on the not really full consensus, though, on the security component here. So certainly, I think most people and governments in Europe would understand the connectivity in terms of economics and other interests, but the why Indo-Pacific matters to the security of Europe, I don't think has been completely fleshed out or understood at all levels. So was very grateful to hear some of your comments, Ambassador Pryor, to me, and I think those are very good points, but ones that we continually need to emphasize across the board. I don't want to go on too long here. There are 3 points I'd like to emphasize before I wrap up. The first is that the Indo-Pacific also cares what Europe thinks, and Indo-Pacific countries are watching European countries, what they do and what they say and what they message. Southeast Asia specifically is watching to see how European positions land on things like the South China Sea, the 2016 tribunal ruling between the Philippines and China, issues of freedom of navigation, on trade, upholding international rules and norms. So these are important issues, and what we say matters, and what European countries say matter. There's a real opacity of decision-making in China when we look at how information is flowing up and down, but what we do know is that Xi Jinping is the primary decision maker, and he values leader-level engagement. And as was mentioned previously, there are a lot of countries and a lot of leaders in Europe. And so having all of those opportunities to engage at the leader level and continue to message strongly on issues that matter for all of our security and global stability is really important. For example, and I was going to bring up the EU summit last week and some of the important messaging that happened there. I won't belabor those points that were already made, but being able to message from European countries to Chinese leadership really emphasizes the independence of European nations and the direct security concerns that Europe has in the Indo-Pacific. And it's important important for China to hear that collective feedback and that alignment of opinions on that, and know that this is not just the US pushing certain issues such as stability and security across the Taiwan Strait. The second point I'd emphasize is that it matters how we do actions, not just the actions that we're taking. It's important, we already mentioned messaging, it's important that we're integrated and aligned, but also important to have demonstrations of support. You know, the topic of economic resilience is one that really concerns a lot of Indo-Pacific countries right now. I'd like to take the example of Australia over the last few years and the resilience that Australia has shown in the face of really severe economic coercion by China. And really how the lesson that has, that Indo-Pacific countries have gained from watching Australia's resilience. And those have been lessons of diversification, lessons of how important it is to have diversified supply chains, but also how important it is to have partners that are willing to have your back and partners that are willing to help you with the alternate trade routes. So I think as we look at how Southeast Asian countries are examining their willingness to stand up for certain issues, such as their sovereignty in the South China Sea, it is important for us to collectively to be messaging our support and helping to shape their decision-making and understanding that they might have more options in terms of being able to stand up and have economic resilience. For Europe, this can mean doubling down on areas that are European strengths, such as maritime domain awareness, capacity building, in terms of trade and concluding trade negotiations, and messaging that Europe will not tolerate coercive trade measures that aim to disrupt the international rules and norms. The last point I'd like to make is how important it is to examine creative solutions based on particular partner expertise. And this, again, is something I'll go back to look at the Pacific as a primary example here. In the Pacific, you have the Pacific Island Forum's 2050 strategy for the Blue Pacific, which is the forum's essentially a roadmap for partner nations in terms of how we should be engaging with the Pacific and their priorities moving forward. And it's been a fantastic document to refer to. Anyone that works on the Pacific, I recommend you take a look at it. But from the US side, it's obvious to us that we not only can we not spread ourselves across the entire Pacific, but there are many objectives in there that we are not ideally aligned for, and that we may not be the best partner for, or Australia might not be the best partner for. There are very bespoke needs in the Pacific, as there are in Southeast Asia, and there are a lot of exceptional capabilities that European partners have where they can really add value specifically on, like I said before, MDA, maritime domain awareness, capacity building, cyber expertise, trade. I won't go into the point too much, but we all know that the US is not excelling at trade relationships at the moment in the Indo-Pacific, and so that is certainly an area where their partners can excel further. Unique health and infrastructure needs, those are others that are really key and needed across the Indo-Pacific, especially the Pacific. So I'll end it there. I could talk about any of these points further, but I'll wrap it up. I know there's probably some questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine. Just a question more closer to home. We're a few weeks away from the Iowa caucuses. Presidential election is looming like a great big cloud on the horizon. China always plays in US presidential elections. It seems that some of the passion might have been taken out, at least so far as the Biden-Xi meeting in San Francisco is concerned. But are we entering a more dangerous period here, as possibly the two parties, and certainly one of the candidates, try and outdo each other for being hawks on China in the coming months? What do you think?
So without venturing too deep into US politics discussion, I will say that working on the Indo-Pacific and on China issues is in some ways interesting from the US perspective because it is so bipartisan. And as you noted, we have seen hawkishness is one of the words that some people use, but certainly an understanding by both sides of the aisle of how critical this subject is to the future of our relationships. So working on issues such as ASEAN, Southeast Asia, the Pacific, I do have some confidence that we will be able to maintain our engagement and our programming because it is so widely understood across the aisles. Now, in terms of how it might play into the debates, as was, I think, mentioned previously, we do tend to have an incredibly boisterous and oftentimes extreme debate season and political campaign trails, but I don't think that necessarily mirrors what would happen for either candidate should they get elected.
Well, that's reassuring. Time for a view from the region. I'm going to ask Bi Young-jo from the Atlantic Council. She's a non-resident senior fellow there, but she's based in Seoul and at the Korea Institute for Defense Analysis. So, Bi, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for invitation to this great panel, and congratulations to CEPS for your 40th anniversary. I'm from Korea Institute for Defense Analysis. We are an institute under Ministry of National Defense. We are of about 300 people, half of which are researchers. But I would have to put a disclaimer that here that the comments are all my personal ideas and does not represent my institute at all. So for preparation for today, I had two tasks in mind. Number one, actually one task, as I flew 15 hours. I should be talking about North Korea, but more than just North Korea. As you know, many of the experts from the Asian region, and including my country, we focus on North Korea issues. But given this occasion today, I hope my role today is to convince you how North Korea issue is still very relevant and very interconnected to global issues that we face today. So in that grounds, I think I can propose three key imminent or priority areas where European region and the Indo-Pacific region can cooperate. And also at the end, I would also suggest two areas of exchanges that we could really work on together to further our future cooperation in this region and in the Indo-Pacific. So the first area is on the nuclear non-proliferation. Ambassador James Moran talked about this a little bit in the beginning, in the opening speech, but I think this concerns us all in this region and also all the countries in the Pacific. It's not just North Korea, as you have observed, that nuclear coercion has become now a part of foreign policy of Russia, China, and North Korea. Unlike the nuclear taboos that we had before, the threshold as far as the declarations are concerned are lowered. And this is something that we have to all tackle together, that we do not see the lowering of the threshold. The second part is we have to look at the possibility of North Korea's opportunistic behaviors in the discussions that we do about simultaneous conflicts in this region. As I observe many of the war games that are coming out on Taiwan Strait from Washington, D.C., I see three kind of common observations, three or four observations made. Number one, if there is a conflict on the Taiwan Strait, it will be a protraction of war. Because it's a protracted war, it says, one of the reports, that it will be a Pyrrhic victory, in which nobody actually gains but loses. Everyone is here to lose. And given the second observation is that because the war would be protracted, the nuclear threshold could be lowered. That's one of the observations. Number three, in case of the conflict, the war games also project that China may target US bases in Asia, including Australia, Japan, and South Korea. And fourth, some of the reports do talk about it, some do not, which is the possibility of North Korea's opportunistic behaviors in case of these kind of contingency. And I think we are already seeing some of it. For instance, in this changing global order with Israeli and Palestinian war, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, we are now seeing deepening or signs of deepening of relations between North Korea and Russia, North Korea, Russia, China possibly. So this is something we have to tackle together. Third area that that is imminent and very important is the challenges that are driving from new technologies, AI, cyber, and so forth. But if you have watched CNN this morning, they've been talking about North Korea's cyber activities, the cryptocurrency theft issue. And I think this cyber threat is not just to South Korea very important, but also all the countries in this region, because as you know more than me, North Korea have already done their cyber attacks in 2017, influencing Britain's hospital network, Germany's rail system, and seeking ransom kind of payments for this. And according to a recent report, in 2022 alone, North Korea earned 1.65 billion US dollars from cryptocurrency theft. South Korea's military budget, in not everything, but military budget for military procurement is about, for next year is about 13.4 billion. So 1.65 billion is a significant amount, and experts project that this has been propelling North Korea's ability to sustain their progress in nuclear missile capabilities. And in the last 15 months, North Korea launched, as far as I know, 121 times of their missiles. And this money is also being filled to their support of other conventional assets, which are being sold to Russia. So it's North Korea issue, but interconnected to the Ukraine issue and the global issues in general. To conclude, for areas of exchanges, I think there is a lot of room to cooperate, exchange the information between NATO, EU countries, and the countries in the Pacific. One area is about the nuclear IQ in general. I think all the countries in the Pacific region, including South Korea, Japan, and Taiwan or other countries, the credibility issue have always come and go about US's extended deterrence issues. But for South Korea, what we have been doing after Washington Declaration recently is to really look at the NATO's conventional nuclear integration with the US, meaning in order to enhance the credibility of extended deterrence, we are trying to increase the clarity of South Korea's conventional military role within the operation of US's nuclear umbrella. There's a lot of lessons, I think, that could be offered from NATO's experience. And this is important in dealing with the spur of debates that come and go within South Korea, which is about asking for US's redeployment of nuclear weapons, nuclear sharing, or even going nuclear itself. These debates can be really settled more if we understand the value of conventional nuclear integration, which Europe and NATO have been doing for many years. And last but not least, the last area of exchange is actually, I'm kind of sidestepping from this topic, but this is something EU could also contribute. Chet Tae-won is CEO of SK, but his remarks recently has been bringing a lot of repercussions recently within South Korea, which is that what he suggested is that in order to enhance Korea-Japan relations and enhance the regional cooperation in this region, we could think about EU-like economic bloc between Korea and Japan. I don't know how feasible this is, but this is a new idea that's been discussed recently. There's something that we could work on together. Thank you.
Thank you. That's a very interesting idea. Just one quick question there on NATO exchanges with like-minded partners in the region, including, of course, very much South Korea. Going back to one of the questions I asked at the beginning, Is there a danger, I mean, vis-à-vis China, that it will be provoked into perhaps giving even more support to Russia and so forth through that? How do you see that, seen from Seoul?
Sorry, for clarification, the possibility of cooperation between...
Yes, the dangers that NATO exchanges and so forth taking place with you in Korea and with Japan and so on will provoke China into being even more supportive of the Russian invasion of Ukraine.
Oh, sure. There is always also this debate whether our engagement, more engagement with NATO could actually cause more escalation in this region. But I would say, as far as I observed, we are in a middle stage. There is, since this NATO engagement, the speed of it is gradual, then very instantaneous or very fast. And China's response, of course, there has been official remarks of criticizing those possibilities, but the actual responses have not been there, so it's ongoing. But I guess given the current security environment in this region, not just South Korea, but all countries seek not only NATO, but building of more partnerships that we could get as we can.
Many thanks. And last but by no means least, we have Ambassador Franz Jessen, who represented the EU in a number of Southeast Asian countries and was long serving in Beijing as well. Franz, over to you. Give us your view.
Yeah, thank you, Jim. It's great to be back in Brussels. My name is Franz Jessen, and the two issues that I think are dominating this morning, South China Sea and Taiwan, are both issues that I've worked and are working on quite extensively. My career was basically Japan, China, ASEAN, Vietnam, and the Philippines. So it's been circling around the South China Sea. And I want to leave one remark on the South China Sea, which I think is worth considering. And that is that when we talk about South China Sea now, we talk mainly about the Philippine-China issue. That's what tends to dominate the discussion. And I think, Catherine, I think you're right that there's a consensus on the American part right now. But my doubt is whether that consensus is the same over time. Because when I look at my years in the Philippines, we started with the Aquino government, Obama, and there was a certain strategy vis-a-vis the South China Sea. Then with Duterte, President Duterte in the Philippines, it changed. And then again, with Bongbong Marcos and the Biden administration, it changed again. So 3 different strategies basically over a 10-year period, and quite different, and leading to quite different results and objectives. Comparing that with Vietnam, where over the same 10 years, basically a very consistent approach from the Vietnamese that in many ways I would say has been quite successful. So I think that's worth considering, the difference between the 2 strategies, and also the way we as foreign partners, we interact in the region. So I tend to be quite cautious on those issues. Concerning Taiwan, I will be going there for quite some time next year, and I've been there twice during this fall. And one of the first questions I got when I met a group of students was from the professor, who asked me, why do you all talk about war between China and Taiwan? Why do you think that is going to happen? And there I think also we have to be careful not to be too different or diverge too much from the domestic situation in Taiwan. We have an election on the 13th of January. 3 parties are competing, but for me, I mean, everybody says DPP is running ahead right now, but for me what is important is that how does the majority of the Taiwanese people look at this issue, and how do they want us to react? And I think we have to follow them and support them as much as we can. If we look at some of the opposing views, we have one view is that Taiwan is such a center of the Indo-Pacific that they have to choose sides. They have to lean towards the West, the US, or they have to lean towards China. And I'm quite critical of that, but it's a view that is dominating in some circles. I'm critical of it because of the economic interest of Taiwan. Taiwan is so close to the mainland. 40% of their trade is with the mainland. It's decreasing, but it's still very high. And we don't want Taiwan to be a type of a Cuba where they are isolated from the economic power next to them. I don't think that's good for their democracy. I don't think it's good for the island. I think on the contrary, we have to make sure that their economy develops so well as it possibly can. And we have to help them in that process because we want a strong, economically strong Taiwan and a democratic Taiwan. But it's not only us in the West, so to speak, that are making things a bit more tense. One discussion with a Chinese official was a bit surprising for me when I went through it. Of course, the official, he said, this is my personal opinion, as Chinese officials they tend to do. But he started out by saying that the one country, two system will not work for Taiwan. And I was a bit surprised to see that, to hear that. Second thing is he emphasized that the time was running out, that the mainland was looking for a solution, a final solution, so to speak. And he felt this was important because the youth of Taiwan were drifting away from the mainland. So better to do something quickly. And then finally, he emphasized the point of a strategic ambiguity. He said, we have learned from the US that we can be unclear in our messaging. We can react in different unexpected ways, and that's what we will do moving ahead. So also on the mainland side, a new way of looking at it, not necessarily a better way of looking at it, but one that we have to take into account and see how we react, how we will react to that. Then we have the EU position on Taiwan. Taiwan is very far away from the European Union. And we talk about it here as if it's next door because we all know the region quite well, us in the room. But in the debate as such, it is quite far away. And I was struck by the distance when I looked through the last couple of, so to speak, official statements about Taiwan and the European Union, going back to the speech by HRVP Borrell when he was in Beijing 2 months ago, where he talked about the 3 yeses and the 3 nos. And one of the no's was a no to an independent Taiwan, which in Taiwan created a little bit of a stir because they thought, why does he have to say that so clearly? This is a new language we don't need to say, and why are we saying that? And I tend to agree with that. I think we should stick to our old language as far as we can. And we should be very careful when we change that. And if we change that, it should only be to the better. Then we go back to last week, and Nicholas, he was there. The summit is in Beijing, where we had 2, I thought, very interesting statements from one from Council President Michel, who said that the EU adheres to its one China policy. And then we had von der Leyen speaking 5 minutes later, and she said the EU acknowledges the one China policy, which is basically American language. And again, there I would think that EU is better served by being consistent in the messaging and adhering to its one China policy, as Jim and I, we have talked about many times, actually gives us the flexibility to define it ourselves. And I think it's a better statement from the point of view of the EU. So I would encourage Nicholas to revert to the old language. Then getting to the reason why I'm going to Taiwan next year, that's basically the issue of decoupling, de-risking, and how the Taiwanese economy is reacting to those pressures. Because I think from a company point of view, of course, de-risking is a very good thing. We have a Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Corporation investing in Japan, US, and Europe. And from a company point of view, that's a logical and probably a good decision. But from a Taiwanese decision, we also risk that we are weakening the economic developments within Taiwan. And if we have this concern about a war across the strait, from company point of view, from European companies' point of view, it doesn't matter if the supplier is from Taiwan or from the mainland, because the war will affect both sides. And therefore, the decoupling, the de-risking will affect the interactions on both sides. And I think that's something that we have to be more cautious about than we are currently, because we do not want to weaken the economic developments in Taiwan. We want the Taiwanese to have a strong economy. It helps their democracy, as I see it. I looked at the figures. We have GDP per capita in Beijing, I think it's around $25,000. In Taiwan, it's about $35,000. It's not a huge difference, and we don't want that difference to decrease over time, because that would weaken the status that Taiwan has right now, in my view. Good. So thank you for that, Jim.
Thank you, Frans, and best of luck when you get over there in Taiwan after the elections. A lot of points there. But I want to move quickly on to the audience. We've got about 20 minutes left of the session, so now it is open to you to raise your hands and ask your questions. I saw you first, sir. Please go ahead. Would you please tell us who you are and, as necessary, where you're from, institutions? A microphone is on its way, I'm reliably told.
My name is Miguel Diaz. I'm retired. I'm an alumni of CSIS going back 20 years ago. My question has to do with India. It's clearly a player that's on its way up, militarily, economically, and so forth. When I look at India and the role that it's played in the past and the risks that it brings, it leaves me a little discomforted. It's obviously played a supportive role of Russia in the current war in Ukraine. It comes with disputed territorial issues with China and Pakistan and elsewhere. It hasn't really played any kind of constructive role in Myanmar. So I'm wondering what is being seen on the part of the White House and on the part of Brussels about the potential role of India in that part of the world that I'm missing?
Thanks. I think we'll take two or three. Xavier.
Thank you. Xavier Nutin, I'm a former EU official and now senior associate of the European Institute for Asian Studies. My question will be for Mr. Kwanström, if I pronounce correctly your name, and congratulations for your new appointment. You have described the concerns of the EU in the region, in the Indo-Pacific region, in security and defense. And it's good to know that the EU is negotiating a security agreement with Japan and Korea. But you did mention the East Asia Summit, unless I've mistaken, that the EU is very keen to join. And as a former ambassador to Singapore, you know that Singapore has never been very enthusiastic about the EU joining the East Asia Summit. So I would like to know what could really be the added value of the EU as a collective body, not the member states, in security and defense, particularly in hard defense. We know hard security, we know about economic security, and the added value that can really be delivered, because we should not make empty promises about the capacity of the EU to cooperate in security and defense and not being able to deliver, otherwise our credibility certainly will suffer a lot. Thank you.
Thanks, Xavier, and these things come in threes. Yes, sir, in the front here, on the second row.
Hello, nice to see you again, James. I'm still alive. Former bureau chief of Mainichi Shimbun in Brussels. I'm still write for the Japanese magazines, including Sekai. It's about this freedom of navigation and sea lane protection. In this context, I would like to know what kind of role can satellite surveillance cooperation play? And in this context, satellite surveillance, EU, US, NATO, and eventually likewise like-minded countries in the regions. At the end of the day, don't you think we need a kind of a coordinating body? And I think of an example of Atlanta, that the EU took initiative vis-a-vis the off-coast Somalia piracies. If such a body could be formed in the future, should we be, China should be inclusive or exclusive? In the same context, Taiwan, should we consider Taiwan be exclusive or inclusive in such a endeavor? Thank you.
Okay, we have 3 questions on the table. There might just be room for more later, so please hold on. Let me quickly go to the panel, and starting, I think, first with you, Nicholas, if you'd like to take up any of those questions. Over to you.
Well, let's see. Let's start with the role of India. It's very clear that India is growing enormously its importance. Just look at the military spending, how, if you look at the way that the top league table has changed, and you'll see how fast India has moved up there. India, of course, I think earlier this year, if we trust the statisticians, has become the most populous nation on earth. It's a growing economic power. You know, India, I think, I'm not here to sort of characterize their foreign policy. You'd have to ask them. But I think it's clear that India looks after its own interests. It approaches, of course, all its relations with the key partners from, you know, their own objectives. I think as one of our most important partners in the region, and clearly will be one of the dominant voices over time, we have to have the dialogue formats that allows us, first of all, to cooperate on things that we share, and not least as democracies, but also to have a frank dialogue on things, for example, on Ukraine. I don't think, you know, I don't know how many hours I myself have spent with Indian colleagues on that. I think it's important that when we do that we don't come as Europeans and sort of whack them over the head with what we feel they should do, but that we have an ongoing dialogue where we very clearly describe the situation as it is viewed from our side, explain to them the significance of something like Russia's war on the global order, in terms of the UN Charter. I think it always helps when you get perspectives like you did when Kaya Kallas spoke at the Shangri-La Dialogue last year from countries that have had the real own experience of this sort of imperialism. So that's something that we have to do with India. So both the partnership and the continued dialogue. But you're right in describing their approach as something that's designed, you know, from their vantage point, and it will only make sense. We first have to understand it to have the discussion with them. But clearly a much more important security and defense actor. And I would say, you know, you just have to go to IISS or these organizations that count all the naval assets and submarines and so on in the Indian Ocean to see that this is going to be a region in the future that is of security policy significance. Yes, on the East Asia Summit, yes, of course, it's a long-running issue. What I would say, to sort of flip it around a little bit, is to say I think that what we're hoping from the European Union side is that our partners in the region increasingly see us as an asset when it comes to discussing security. Actually, if you look at the European Union, its global role from development cooperation, the part of security that pertains to climate change, that pertains to human security, our role in doing some of these exercises, some of the maritime security operations, it's a growing role, but it's also like a role that we can play as a trusted, transparent partner. And I think as such, it actually makes sense to have the European Union in the East Asia Summit. And again, it's not something that, you know, we will take to them and demand that, you know, they absolutely have. I think they will see it. We're hoping that, and it's our job to convince our partners that we belong there. And I think as a global security actor, and one that increasingly, I mean, in the geopolitical shocks, not least with Ukraine, that the European Union has suffered, and the realization, not least manifested through the Indo-Pacific strategy, that the security in Asia-Pacific in the Indo-Pacific is very much part of our own core security, and in a more interconnected world where we are one of the main actors. We're a key trading partner, key investor for many of these countries. Same if you look at the development cooperation side, and an increasingly active security partner as well. So we hope to convince them is the short answer. And I've always said that I think the key to doing that is to engage, to show up to the meetings in the region, to build these partnerships. And the more countries we have individual partnerships with, you know, the easier it will be for us to build that credibility. Now, on the question of satellites, on the governance of it, I feel like there will be some colleagues somewhere in the building working on that very hard that will be very upset if I sort of off the cuff the future governance of satellites and so on. But what I would say on space in general, that space is something, is an area that is also growing, not just in terms of military and security aspects, but also a lot of our future actions. I think I remember when I was ambassador in Singapore, we hosted a hackathon, which was called Hack Space for the Planet. And we had lots of young university students come up with solutions to use satellites and space to solve climate change issues. Very, very creative. So this is something, an area both for on the hard security and the kind of human security and climate change that we need to work on. And the EU, of course, has a space strategy for security and defense, and in this critical domain for our societies. And again, it's about building the partnerships. I think the EU is going about it by building sort of mainly individual partnerships. It's done on a country by country basis. But the EU adopted a first ever space strategy for security and defense earlier this year. And the EU owns and operates space assets. It's PNT Galileo and EO Copernicus. And so the EU SATCEN also provides a unique geospatial intelligence analysis capacity, support decision-making and actions of the EU and its member states. So in line with that strategy, we're increasingly addressing space security and defense in the political discussions with all our third country partners. And these dialogues are valuable to engage on a future area, and coming back to an original, like a theme that I would say permeates all of our corporations in the Indo-Pacific. It's about resilience. It's about the resilience of our own resilience and the resilience of our partners that we hope to build together. Did I forget something?
I don't think you did. That was pretty comprehensive. Can we go on down the panel, and Catherine next? Pick up whatever you like from those questions.
Great, thank you. Very comprehensive. I'll just add a couple points. On India, I think, I mean, you hit on a lot of the complexities involved with relationships with India, but as was already pointed out, we're talking about the largest democracy in the world, a very key player, and one that will only continue to be more important in the region. So I think that's one reason why, elevating the Quad has been so important. And there have been some pretty significant initiatives through health, a maritime domain awareness initiative that the Quad is rolling out right now in Southeast Asia and the Pacific, and others that India has weighed in on quite a bit, and I think will only continue to do more so. I should also point out that India is another observer to the partners in the Blue Pacific, and just hosted all of the leaders in Papua New Guinea. Prime Minister Modi was there just prior to Secretary Blinken getting out there in May. So they have been quite involved and are interested in doing a lot more, and I think we'll continue to encourage that. On security, I just add one thing. Completely agree that when we talk about security and defense in Southeast Asia and ASEAN, it's about more than just the traditional defense mechanisms. But when we do think of security and defense and what the EU could add, I think there's a lot of really special capabilities that the EU does have in terms of maritime domain awareness, in terms of maritime law enforcement, and that's another key area that we are looking to try to do more in as well. Not just the big navies, right? Not just the big boats, but thinking about our coast guards, thinking about helping them build capacity to monitor and enforce their own sovereignty, and that's going to be the case in the Pacific as well. So I think there's some key areas there that the EU could really add value. And satellites, yeah, I think similarly, a lot. I know there are some initiatives already underway, and that's certainly an area that's being explored, as I mentioned, with the MDA programming that the Quad is working on, and certainly seen as an important component of adding to awareness and enforcement. excluding or including China, I think that's really going to depend on the mechanism. In some cases, we want to be going through regional forums, such as the International Fusion or the IFC, I forget what the I is for, in Singapore, of which China has members there sitting on the deck and on the floor. So there may be areas where more information across the board is better for everybody, but there are going to be situations, of course, where we have to worry about the technical aspects and capacity of what we're sharing.
Thanks. And on to B next. Byung-jo.
Thank you very much. I think I can touch upon the question about the freedom of navigation and satellites. My thoughts on the freedom of navigation is the following. In South Korea as well, which never talks really about Taiwan issue in official spheres, we do talk about it in non-official spheres, in which we talk about the importance of freedom of navigation, how much imports and exports really rely on the Taiwan Strait part. So it's an important issue. But as far as I observe, it's not just South Korea, but the countries in the region, in the Indo-Pacific. It's very hard for us to get in foot in this region in dealing with freedom of navigation, purely given the number of limited ships in the sea. And even Australia with AUKUS, their nuclear-propelled submarines will be, the first one will be procured after 2030. So given the time frame, what we can do actually on foot, it's an important issue, but limited. And therefore, I think the satellite is one of the key areas, including cyber, where the countries in the Pacific region can actually work on together. And in terms of threats, it is also a very important issue. Nicholas also mentioned about the commercial side of the satellite issue. I think that's a key area of the cooperation. And to talk a little bit, just one more point about the military side, I think satellite cooperation is very important because it means information sharing, and we are trying to see things together. And anything that's to translate into military collaboration, coordination, or operation, I think this information sharing, seeing things together, coordinating the complexities of the space is the important first step that we have to do. So it will mean a lot in the future.
And France, finally.
Yeah, maybe just a quick word on the East Asia Summit. I agree fully with Niklas. The EU has much to offer. And the more the EU has to offer, the stronger is the likelihood of being invited to the table. But of course, there's also the other issue, that is that is the EU ready to field the necessary manpower to the East Asia Summit. We've seen that in the past, that the participation at the top level was not always what we desired. So I think it's a question also to which extent we politically in the European Union, to which extent the European Union is politically committed to participate in that type of work in a relatively far away region, as I mentioned before. On satellites, I agree fully with what was said just before me. Initiatives like that, if we can get Taiwan and the mainland to work together within such a framework, yes, let's try that.
Thank you, Franz. I think we've reached the end of our session, and I hope you've got some takeaways from that. I want to thank all of our panelists. I want to thank all of you for attending. I'm not going to try and summarize that because this is such a huge region with such massive challenges ahead. Just to make one remark, when I used to do a job very similar to what Nicholas does now in the EAS many years ago, you often had the feeling that it was indeed Asia-Pacific, as it then was Indo-Pacific, call it what you will now, was very far away. I don't think that's the case anymore. I think it's getting closer and closer, whether we like it in Europe or not. And we should remember, quite a few people don't like it, but it's happening. And we need certainly many more discussions like this going forward. So thank you all once again. Give us a round of applause for our panelists. And let me add that for those of you who are members of this august institution, CEPS, there is indeed a free lunch on offer upstairs. Am I right in saying that, Dylan? It is free? There you are. There is indeed such a thing, if only here at CEPS. Thank you so much. Thank you. Have a good day.